Okay, welcome everyone to today's lecture where we'll be talking about play-based learning. Now, in this particular video, I'm mainly referring to play-based learning in primary schools, high schools, and to a smaller extent in adult education. If you're looking for some information about play-based learning when it comes to the really little kids, that's probably a different video. But the broad concepts really apply across the board, no matter what age group that we're talking about. Now, to begin with, just a quick little definition. Play-based learning is all about recreation. So it's all around the idea that students are playing. Normally that involves some type of social element and some type of either gross motor or fine motor activity. It can also be, there are really three types, or three categories, I guess, of play-based learning. Oh, that pen doesn't work. We have, the first type is structured, and the second type is semi-structured, and the third type is unstructured. Or I guess non-structured, whatever you want to say that last one is. Now, these three types are used all over the world in year 1, in year 7, in year 11, with adults as well. And it's important to really think about which one of those that you're going to be using when you're going through the process of designing activities. So, for example, you will know that almost regardless, let's say, no, not regardless of the age. Let's say you're teaching or working as a teacher aide or whatnot with, I don't know, say a year 5 group of students. Then most lessons or most activities follow a very similar pattern, probably say 80% of the time. Even if you're doing constructivist type learning, which has a lot of play-based elements built into it, that's kind of for a separate video, but I will touch on that here. You're always going to have some type of explicit type instruction at some point. Now, that's because a pure play-based learning type program isn't really a learning program at all, in my opinion anyway, because students then don't have any formal direction or formal information from a teacher or from a more knowledgeable other person. Possibly in the early childhood sector, if you're dealing with 3-year-olds, that might be a different case in point, because there is some element of learning that happens from a social perspective and so on and so forth. That does happen as we move through the years as well. But when we talk about play-based learning as an actual teaching strategy, not as just a buzzword that's thrown out there by childcare centres in marketing and things like that, but when we actually talk about it in specific reference to being a teaching strategy that is consciously chosen to help meet specific goals, obviously we're talking about it in a way that means we want students to learn something that is specifically set by the teacher or the teacher aide or whoever's developing that program. So we have specific learning goals in mind. They're not just playing with other kids or playing on their own, and maybe we could sort of have some tenuous link between that activity and the fact that they're developing some type of fine motor or whatever skill because they're playing in the sandpit. So we're more so referring to the types of this as I guess a teaching strategy that is planned and has specific goals, and it relates directly to the goals of that lesson or activity or week or whatever. So there is a bit of a fine difference there. So in almost all lessons, there's some type of explicit instruction in this sense. And what that means is that the teacher, teacher aide, a trainer, or whoever it is, will be saying to students or talking to students about the types of things that they want them to learn. Here's what I want you to learn. Here are the goals for the lesson. Here's the information and the concepts. That might include some worked examples, which is sort of like what not like what I'm doing at the moment, but where you use a whiteboard and go through, say, a maths problem or whatnot. It's got what we call some didactic teaching or didactic instruction, and that's basically just lecturing. So that's almost sort of like what we're doing now. well, it is like what we're doing now. You've got some type of modelling or some type of model, so you're showing students how to go about doing things. It normally has some type of practice or purposeful practice. So some type of practice activity is very important. That can usually be or will be individual, pair, group, whole of class, etc., etc. So that's the sort of practice activities in the middle. Now that can also be any aspect of that really can be no, I won't write PBL because that's problem-based learning. That's a different thing altogether. So that is play. Anywhere in there is where you have your play-based learning. So that's how it fits into, say, your standard explicit instruction type thing. So you'll have a worked example intro at the start. That might take, say, 10 minutes. You're showing a student a maths problem or something. You might be modelling it. Normally that's included in the worked example. And some type of practice. Quite often you might start with, say, pair practice for an activity, maybe individual practice. And the play-based learning stuff can either come at the end, or it depends what type of students you're teaching, what year you're teaching, what topic you're teaching. Sometimes play-based learning can happen for the entire length, other than the first, might only take 30 seconds or 2 minutes. Even if you're teaching sport of some description, for example, there's still also always some type of explicit instruction at the start. So the sports teacher will still demonstrate how to kick a ball, how to use a hockey stick, how to throw a ball, how to do long jump or whatever. They might not, if you're doing running or something, they might not demonstrate how to run 100 metres, but they'll go through that. And that's part of that purposeful practice. So a type of purposeful practice that we use called purposeful practice, which is a teaching strategy. I've also got videos about that. It's also known as deliberate practice. So I don't know anything about running or whatnot, but if the sports teacher is teaching kids how to do, say, a 100-metre race, then they would show them how to start at the line, why they use a gun, all this type of stuff, where to put their hands, where to put their feet, how to position yourself to start with and to slowly stand up. I don't know, I'm making this up because I don't know what I'm talking about. Anyway, the purposeful practice is about dividing that process up into little different pieces, into small chunks and whatnot. That's all a part of that explicit instruction model. I've got a video on explicit instruction. It's really important and I think you should watch it if you're learning anything about play-based learning and you have the goal to actually teach students something as opposed to letting them just go off and play, because sometimes that's called play-based learning, but in the education world, that doesn't really fit the definition in my view. And that's not to say that that's not valuable, particularly for younger kids, for that leisure recreation type activity, but it's not what we're talking about here. So what I'm trying to say here is that in a general overall lesson, that's where that play-based learning really fits. So you might go through, if you've got a standard lesson plan, and say at the start there, you've always got your review. So this is your standard lesson plan for, say, explicit instruction. Or, well, when I say explicit instruction, explicit instruction typically means just your normal sort of class lessons where you explain things. There are activities throughout to try and develop and practice, and then there's a review at the end. It's kind of, I liken explicit instruction to just good old-fashioned high-quality teaching, which is what the majority of teachers do anyway, even though they're not taught how to do it specifically at university, because these traditional strategies don't really align with the types of things that they teach at universities and whatnot. But I like to sort of point it out anyway, and I talk about it a lot throughout these different lessons and activities. The other one, sort of like, I guess you could say the opposite of explicit instruction, is constructivist learning. And constructivist learning is very much, I guess you could think of it almost completely as play-based learning I guess at this stage, if you've never heard of that before. If you just think of explicit instruction as very teacher-directed and constructivist learning or constructivist teaching as very play-based learning, so that's then I think that will give you a fair idea of the difference at the moment. And that's used a lot mainly with kids, and they do things like discovery learning and imaginative play and so on and so forth. So they're developing their skills and knowledge by constructing things and constructing a schema of the world around them. So they sort of go in there, I guess you could say they go in their own direction a lot. But there are different types of play-based learning and constructivist methodologies, I guess, that can be either structured, semi-structured or unstructured. Normally, actually, the purest constructivist is quite unstructured and ideologically, I guess, but in reality, it's not. In reality, when you actually see it in a classroom, it's probably pushing towards being more structured anyway. And there are still elements of explicit instruction, even though those who say they're a constructivist teacher or whatever, they're not really constructivists in that pure sense. They're actually still doing quite a bit of explicit instruction. And you especially see that in teaching things like reading and writing, where there is a body of knowledge that has to be passed on from one person to another, from the teacher, teacher aide, parent, whoever, to the student. We still need to learn things. Even if it's just learning like full stops and how to capitalize letters and things, you can't learn that by playing with stuff. You have to learn that from another person, generally speaking. Anyway, so I won't go any further into that, I guess, that rabbit hole, but basically your simple lesson, let's say, taking an average lesson, a review there, and let's say you have some type of conclusion/review down the bottom. You might have up the top there where you're doing your modelling. It's where you're going through and showing examples of doing stuff on the board. Let's say you do some individual practice there, and then here you might do some pair work, where they're practicing. And then at the end there, you've got like a whole of class activity. And this could be some type of game or some type of play-based activity. So that again is another sort of way of just expressing the basics of how a lesson plan in most schools will happen and how personally I would structure it. Now, that doesn't mean you have to follow these structures. You could, of course, just do play-based learning across there like that. That's not really a problem. I still always recommend doing some type of thing at the start, whether you want to call it a review or introduction or some type of instructions or whatever. But there's always some type of teacher-centered activity here, student-centered activity there, and again, teacher-centered activity at the very end, just to sort of bookend it. I think there'd be very few people who are actual practicing teachers with 10 or 15 years experience who would argue with that type of model. So anyway, again, that's just more my personal opinion than anything, but that's how I would use play-based learning as it applies to a particular, as it applies to just your standard sort of lesson. That doesn't necessarily mean that you have to do play-based learning here, but if you were going to do it, certainly it's more than likely that it's going to be a game or some type of activity that's used to consolidate learning as a bit of leisure time, to help that information just be processed in a different way. Some students, particularly those kinesthetic type learners or who like learning in that fashion, it will help them not only enjoy the lesson and be more motivated and so forth. It might help with behaviour as well, but it'll help that information to go from short-term memory to long-term memory and for the concept to really gel, depending on what you're teaching. So there are, we'll go over here. There are several different reasons for why play-based learning is important. And I think it is very important to think about these different strategies because there are hundreds of them, and from my perspective I like to say that here are all the strategies. Here's my personal opinion, and my opinion on things change all the time. So, you know, when it comes to constructivist or any other different types of strategy, I'll have one opinion today when I'm doing the webinar, but I'm open to hearing new things. I'm always reading new things and finding out new bits of information. Nothing irks me more than when people are ideologically constructivist and hate doing this other thing or hate doing explicit, or they're ideologically explicit instruction and hate doing this type of instruction. Because from my point of view, I think they're all tools. You don't see electricians or plumbers being ideologically opposed to using a certain tool in their toolkit or whatever. They use whatever tool helps them achieve their goals. So that's how I like to sort of explain that. Anyway, so there are a bunch of reasons for why all strategies should be used, the pros and cons, or the pros, I guess you could say. And with play-based learning, just get that off so it doesn't confuse anyone. With play-based learning, one of them obviously is that students can help develop their social skills. So what that means is while they're going through the process of, say, building a cubby house or negotiating with another student, how to play a game, running around playing tag or whatever they're doing. During that process, they're socialising, and that means they're learning how to use new vocab, use different types of words, express themselves in different ways. To get their point across, they may need to change their tone, be slightly more aggressive maybe, or slightly more conciliatory. So they're learning all these different emotions, and they're learning what is fair and how to play and so on and so forth. And so I like to just, in my mind, when I think of play-based learning and its importance, the first thing that pops into my mind is puppies, and when puppies are learning how to play. And that's because, I don't know if you've ever had a puppy before, but I've had quite a few, and I'm a dog person. So what happens is when you get a puppy, maybe not straight away, but eventually at whatever week it is after they've been born, they start teething. And when they start teething, they start ripping you to shreds. And you'll have cuts all over your arms, and they want to play, and they're not aggressive, but they've got super sharp teeth, and they want to chew everything. The inside of my car on the back seat where my dog sits all has been ripped to shreds by my dog. So that's probably going to devalue my car quite a bit, although I don't think it's going to be worth much by the time I sell it anyway. So I like to think of play-based learning in the same go. Those dogs are not only are they teething, but they're also learning as they're going through, and they're playing with their owner, they're playing with other puppies. They're learning their own strength. They're learning how hard they can bite, how hard they're allowed to scratch, and those types of things. And it's lucky that they learn that when they're little, because when they were big, say they were a 2 or 3 year old fully grown dog, still learning how hard they're allowed to bite their owner when they're playing, or even when they're roughed up and they get that crazy look in their eyes, dogs still know, generally most of them, know how hard they're allowed to bite, and those types of things. And they learn through that play that, oh, I'm not allowed to scratch like that, or I'm not allowed to do this, or it's inappropriate to bite someone's face and things like that. So the same with kids. They are learning how to interact with each other. What's acceptable? What's not acceptable? They get to practice using those high utility words. They get to negotiate. They get to do all those different types of things. So they might learn what words are appropriate, what words are not appropriate, and so on and so forth. So obviously with that, there is those emotional skills. And those emotional skills involve things like losing a game, or playing tag and being out straight away. Or playing hide and seek and dealing with another human being, a peer, who is cheating, for example. So how do they go as a group when there's no adults around and it's fully unstructured play? Well, even if it's the other type, but if there's no adult directly supervising, how do students deal with those types of feelings of frustration and so on and so forth? So that's the emotional side of it: anger, frustration, how they end a game if they can't be bothered playing anymore, or one student is unfair and they're unhappy. How they go through and deal with all those different types of emotions is a skill that they develop over time, and again through repetition and practice. So that's the social aspect to it. That's the emotional aspect to it, and why social and emotional play is important. And again, thinking about puppies, just to use a bit of an analogy, imagine if they weren't allowed to play. So imagine if they were permanently locked in a cage until they were, say, 2 years old, and then you let a dog out, and you would know, if you've ever owned a dog that you've rescued, that those dogs are mentally handicapped in a way. So they're, I wouldn't say mentally challenged, but they usually have some type of neurological problem, depending on the dog breed and so on. But generally speaking, if they miss out on those opportunities early in life, then that has a significant impact on the way in which they behave for the rest of their lives, even 10 or 15 years later. And while I don't like comparing kids to puppies, it does give you a good analogy to start seeing, or to start understanding, that play-based learning has a significant importance, not just in an academic sense or in a physical sense, which is the next one, but also in an emotional, psychological, I guess, and social sense. So the next one I wanted to talk about was physical, as I was saying. So from a physical perspective, you've got two. We usually divide physical and physical development. So when we talk about these things, we talk about play-based learning and physical development. And development. Generally, we talk of it in terms of development. And by the way, developmental curriculum, which is pretty much what all curriculums are these days, particularly with kids, not so much with adults. The idea with the developmental curriculum is that let's say there are all these different stages, and the idea is that if a kid starts at this stage, then your job is to help them develop to there. So that's all developmental curriculum. It's like developing a building or whatever. It's just about getting them to that next level. So if that's level 1, that's level 2, that's level 3, that's level 5. And we talk about stages in different ways, early childhood, middle childhood, things like that, different curriculums divided up in different ways. But irrespective of where a child is at in a particular class or a group, your job is to figure out where they're at, or maybe not even figure that out, but just help them get to that next level. So if they're at 1, you want them to get to 2, or you want them to get to 3. If they're already at 3, we'll use a different colour here. If they're already at 3, then you want them to get to 4, and so on and so forth. So that's the idea there, is that with a developmental sort of curriculum. So everything in the play-based world is all about development. Anyway, so you've got obviously your fine motor and you've got your gross motor. I don't know why one's capitalised and one's not there, but fine motor basically is just using tips of your fingers, and gross motor is about using big parts of your body, kicking a ball, this kind of stuff, right? So that's the difference between fine motor and gross motor. Obviously for enjoyment, enjoyment is another reason. That's pretty obvious. Obviously there are advantages of kids wanting to go to school. There's leisure. Enjoyment. I guess enjoyment and leisure is the same thing. And I've dropped my eraser. Enjoyment / leisure. We'll put that one together. So leisure is also about reducing stress and anxiety and things like that, and being able to, well, I guess de-stress. But I guess there's a slight difference between enjoyment and leisure. What was I going to put? Oh, fitness. So fitness is obviously a really important one in this day and age, particularly when kids are playing a lot of video games or watching TV and things like that. So not to comment on that, but to say that the more opportunities we can give kids when we have them in an environment like a childcare centre or a school or an outside school hour care, or even for adults, the more of this type of stuff we can provide. And that doesn't mean that they're learning how to run marathons or climbing 40 feet up a tree or anything, but it means flexibility, and it means coordination, and it does mean strength to an extent. And again, just think of the puppies and sort of what they get from that. If one puppy is playing with its owner and just mucking around for half an hour on the floor while you're kind of half watching TV, say, I mean, that puppy's not going to get strength from that. They're not going to suddenly be some steroid junkie dog, but they are developing just that, particularly that coordination and that strength. They are developing, I guess you could say, they are developing their muscles, but also that coordination of being able to roll over and so on and so forth. So kids they will wrestle and play fight and different things like that. So they learn to use their own strength. So they learn their own strength. And a lot of these activities, I'm sort of hesitant to divide fitness up into lots of different sections, because it is hard to sort of explain how you can develop pure strength from an activity before, like I was saying, playing with the puppy or 2 kids play fighting and whatever. But I guess it's that overall fitness and overall general health. And general health. There's also that cardio type skills. So it's kids running around playing and puffing and breathing and sweating and so on and so forth. So they develop that that cardio as well, or they maintain that cardio fitness, or a certain level of natural cardio fitness by being outside. And there's a few other things as well. I think sunlight, I'm just going to add that one in, because obviously we know how important vitamin D is, and just being out in the sun. Obviously it's important for kids to not be to get burnt and things like that, but sunlight is very important. So yeah, there's various, and there's probably lots of other ones as well. So they're the different reasons for why, again, fitness is a super important one. Another one that I always like to add is, well, I've got social / communication, social / communication. Yeah, we'll put that one together. Memory, and I guess we'll call it concept understanding. Yes, concept understanding. So memory and concept understanding are really important, not so much in the unstructured play, but if you're playing games with kids in a classroom setting, even these types of things here. This is what I was talking about in my phonics webinar I did the other day. So these are different games you can play with flashcards. Those games don't always have to be running around outside doing the nature-based play type of thing. They can just be simple games where you're flashing a card up and students have to write it down in a bingo type thing or whatever. So there's lots of different ways that you can do play-based learning, but it's particularly useful in the classroom environment in terms of memory, concept understanding, and being able to recollect being able to remember information. So you learn information today. If you do some type of activity, it just helps consolidate it. But then that activity or some type of fun game can be used in the future. So the beginning of next lesson, that can be the review that is used to, instead of doing a formal review where the teacher's up the front and saying, okay, well, this is how we do algebra. We do this, and then we do that, and then the X goes here and the Y goes there. Is there a way that you could do a fun little game to be able to get that happening and to get that memory happening so that they have some recall from previous sessions and whatnot, but also the idea that you just get up and just get the blood flowing. So this is called, another one is called movement integration. Movement integration. So movement integration basically means that, called MI. So with MI, that's the idea that you're getting I like to think of it as in you're getting the blood flowing. So if people are, say you take a group of Year 9 students or even, I don't know, Year 12 students, if they're sitting down all day and then they come to your class. I used to teach, when I used to teach Year 11s and 12s, some of the periods were from, say 3 o'clock till 5 o'clock on goodness knows what days, Thursdays, Fridays, for example. I don't think they scheduled them on Friday, I can't remember. But either way, I remember having a big Monday where it was 2-hour blocks, 4 2-hour blocks. So by the time you get to that final 2-hour block, you're absolutely stuffed. The students are absolutely stuffed. It's a Monday anyway. So that particular lesson at the end of the day, it'd be good to add in some type of movement integration there. It's well known. I've been to some PDs before many, many years ago with some behaviour management experts who were talking about, they didn't use the term, but they had this idea that this was for middle school, and I think it was called Managing Challenging Boys or something like that. And it was all about those kids who are enjoy their sport, overly excitable, very active, that kind of thing, getting them to do those subjects that they might be less interested in, like English and maths and whatnot, by using a lot of movement integration. They didn't use that term because this is I don't know if this is a new term, but I don't think it's been around for too long. But point is, it is well known that getting people up, getting them to move around is really good for your memory, really good for that to get that concept understanding happening. So if you've learnt it in theory on page, on paper or on the board, being able to also do it in some type of game or to practice it in some type of game can really help as well. And the same with the movement integration. Well, that is, I guess, what you would call movement integration. And when you think about it, I guess play-based learning is a type of movement integration, or is movement integration. I guess they're synonyms in a way. But when we do talk about that term mainly refers to the idea that you're in class for, say, an hour, a formal school class, say maths, and at some point during that lesson, you're getting students to stand up and there's a learning activity that involves some type of movement. So anyway, that's movement integration. Now, there are lots of other reasons for why play-based learning is really effective and really important. I think it's the main takeaway is that it's not just one reason. So it might be for academic reasons, it might be for social reasons. If you're working with students who have neurological disorders, for example, this area here or this area here is something where you might need to concentrate on in terms of using social stories, for example, where you can teach kids how to lose or how to be more sportsmanly-like. and so forth. So, okay, the last thing I wanted to talk about, I'll leave that up because I do know some people like taking screenshots and whatnot, so I'll leave that up for as long as I can. There are various different types of play-based learning, and I'm not going to go through all of them because I think they do overlap, and you don't need to memorize these or anything, but just bearing in mind if you are going to set some type of play-based learning activity, we always have our SMART goals, right? That's not spelled like that at all. So I've got a video on that, watch that, because it's still relevant. Good teaching practice always involves some type of goal, even if you're a constructivist type, even if you're following that constructivist type model, you're still going to be setting goals of some description because there's a reason why you're doing that particular teaching strategy. Otherwise you wouldn't do it, you would do something else. So we're always setting goals, whether we like it or not, whether we think about it actively, we're always setting goals. There are always reasons behind why we are doing something. All you are doing here is articulating in the most specific term possible why you were doing that particular activity or what the purpose of this lesson or this activity or this entire term is. Okay, so anyway, once you've got your goals and then you know what your lesson structure or activity structure is, so you know what kids are doing between say 9 and 10, whether you're doing a bit of board work or whatever you're doing in there, helping kids with reading, whatever it is, whether you're a teacher, teacher aide or teaching adults, so forth, and you decide that you want to do some type of game or some type of play-based activity, the next thing to really think about is, well, specifically what type of activity, what type of play-based learning are you going to do? And there's a whole different bunch, there's a whole range of different types, and they do overlap, but when you choose to use one specific type over another type, it means that your emphasis is really changing. So anyway, you have, the first and most obvious one is physical play. You've got creative, imaginative. No. Imaginative play. Thinking that might be imaginative. Yeah, imaginative play. Now, you can see why physical play here, physical play obviously matches more so to here. And so there's still going to be social aspects to it and emotional aspects to it. They're still going to develop in this area. It's still obviously going to help here and possibly some of these other areas as well. But the main idea, if you decide that you're going to do physical play, the main thing that you're trying to do is to improve this area. So in that area, your fine motor or gross motor or whatever. So you have a specific target for what you're trying to achieve with that particular type of play. And I'll just write these up. Now the next few different types, and again they sort of overlap, so you've got that imaginative type play, so they might be doing dress-ups or whatever, and they're imagining that they're in a different scenario. They might be building cubby houses and things like that. So discovery play, so this is more of a, not necessarily a nature-based thing, but normally it's a nature-based thing, so that can be as you're walking through, say, a grassed area or a lot of childcare centres and outside school hour centres, and the younger primary school areas have the ability for students to be able to do a lot of that more exploratory type activities. There's manipulative play, so this is where you might see kids using Play-Doh or in a sand pit or doing that more so. It's kind of halfway between fine motor and gross motor. They're kind of doing a little bit of both. I'm sure there's probably a technical term around that, but they're sort of in the middle there. So that's your manipulative play. And again, you can see how that might overlap with your imaginative play if they're going through and, you know, trying to use their imagination for various different things. And there's just a couple more. Did I do social? Yeah. Okay, so you've basically got noisy and quiet. So this, again, this is just two different types or different ways of figuring out the direction that you're going to go at and the sort of targets that you're going to have. you might have some activities that are quite noisy. For example, and usually that'll be this physical side of it. So for example, if they're playing a sports game, or the social side of it, maybe even the emotional side of it. But you might be doing some activities down here that are a lot more quiet. So just bearing that in mind, I guess another way to sort of figure out how specifically you're going to approach this idea of implementing play-based learning into your lesson plan or activities or whatnot. And an example of quiet play is silent ball. So I did a video on games and quizzes, and silent ball was the example I used because that's one of the games I used to play with. You could play with year 2s, year 12s. Everyone loves playing silent ball. So that's an idea. That's an example of quiet play. And even if there is some noise happening, but it's certainly not noisy play, that's for sure. Okay, you've obviously got social play, so that may or may not involve any of the other ones up here. And dramatic play. And so imaginative play is usually with objects of some description, like a truck or a toy or something like that. But dramatic play is more along the lines of, think of costumes and dressing up. I think I said dressing up here. So again, there is that bit of an overlap there. But I think imaginative play is more so associated with, I guess, those with objects and so forth. Whereas dramatic is more along the lines of putting on some type of, I think of it like a drama type of thing. I think I picture in my head kids running around dressed up as firemen or whatever. So that's your dramatic play as well. Now, obviously they overlap, so you don't need to say, well, I'm doing this one, but I'm never going to do these or something like that. There is a big overlap there. It's good to be able to use some of this terminology because it is common terminology that you will find in the education sector, particularly if you're working with early childhood teachers or educators who work in that space a lot. These are quite well known. Now, just quickly, I just wanted to make that link between, we made the link between these, which is the different types of play, or some of the different types of play, with some of the pros and some of the reasons why play is important and why, based on your SMART goals, what you want to achieve. Because remember, in any educational lesson or sequence of events, sequence of lessons or activities or whatever, we always figure out what we want to achieve first. So we have our goal. So what do we want kids to learn? So do we want them to improve their social skills? Okay. And then the next step is to then identify specifically what we mean by improve their social skills, like have some, really nail that down. I don't think it's good practice to say we want them to just improve their social skills, because that doesn't really give us any tangible or specific way of being able to go about achieving that. So once you've got your SMART goal, even when it's something a bit more abstract like social skills or communication or whatever, then you can sort of figure out how you want to go about doing it or what type of play you want to use. At the same time, and sorry, just remember, with these it's more of an, don't think of these as types of play, think of this as when you're doing play-based activity, you have this type of emphasis. So it's an emphasis on the physical side or emphasis on manipulative or whatever. Anyway, so there are 3 ways that you could do either of these. So with physical play, it can be structured, semi-structured or unstructured. With noisy, again, it can be structured, semi-structured or unstructured. With dramatic, again, it can be structured, semi-structured or unstructured. Now, obviously with structured, and it's a spectrum, right? So, there are different variations as far as structured, because there are sort of borderline ones and so forth. I wouldn't be too concerned with saying I'm going to do structured, but I'm not going to do this, because you might be more structured for certain kids within the same class, but then for others it might need to be more semi-structured, particularly if you're a teacher developing these type of programs and then you've got a teacher aide who is assisting a student with disabilities. They might be working in this area, whereas the majority of the class in a general or inclusive classroom will be working at this sort of level. Now, complete unstructured simply means that it doesn't quite mean that the kids are going off and doing whatever they want. They are still limited to the resources and to certain areas and to rules, and they do know that they're still being watched. So by unstructured, it doesn't mean see you later, come back in 3 hours, although I guess that is a type of extreme unstructured play. Unstructured simply means that you're not forcing children to do, or adults to do, certain activities. Now, so this is what students will do, say, at on their lunch break, or when they have free play, where they can go and they can choose to go in the sandpit, or they can go play on the grass, or they can do whatever. So that's kind of a free play thing, where they can run around and choose who they want to play with and all this kind of stuff. Semi-structured is kind of halfway between both. So that whoever is facilitating that may set up a sandpit, but it has certain toys there, and students have a choice between doing that activity and that activity. If they're doing, say, this activity, which has got something to do with numbers or phonics, they may have to go through and do a certain thing. They have certain goals. They may need to, let's say painting, for example. Painting, they can choose to do some type of painting using certain colours, or today we're trying to draw a person, or tomorrow we're trying to draw a cat, or whatever. So that might be semi-structured. So there's some direction, but the student is still sort of doing whatever they want, or the child or the adult or whatever. But there is that element of choice that's involved in it as well. So I guess you could think of that as more so being facilitated than anything. Structured is along the lines of what you might have here, where, and even here if you're in a sports class or something, but structured is where you're in a classroom, or you're specifically directing students to do things in a certain order. There's less ability for the students to socialise. They still may be socialising, but less of a chance and less of a choice. So I guess you could also think of these as a spectrum of choice. So less choice, a little bit more choice, tons of choice. A structured game or play-based learning might be some type of sing-along. It could be the fact that they can paint anything they want, other way around. So it can be the fact that they're painting, but you're helping them paint a certain thing. All the students will generally be painting the certain thing, and you're going through doing specific steps and stages. So first we use a pencil, and then we do this, and then we do that, and we stop and we think about it, and we plan it out, and we mix this. And there's time involved as well. So we do this for a few minutes or whatever. So there's a lot more structure around that. Quite often with play-based learning, it sits about here, kind of in between the two, I would think. My sort of gut instinct is there, that that is probably the most common point to aim a lot of the different types of play there. But of course, that completely depends on you and your situation, and where you're teaching and what your role is, and so on and so forth. So that's my take on play-based learning. The last thing I'll say about that is, yes, you can use play-based learning. Obviously, you can use it in the early childhood area, because effectively that is a play-based learning curriculum. It is a play-based learning curriculum, really. And as we go through the grades, we typically do less and less play-based learning. But I would encourage you to do as much play-based learning as you can with older students as well, including those that are working in the adult sector. I think it's a really important way to help people with that concept understanding, to help them, not so much for leisure, but to reduce anxiety. I'm just going to write A and Z there because I want to wrap this one up. So that's my take on play-based learning. I hope you learned something, and good luck.